What's the story, everyone? Welcome back to Gaelic Games Fan TV. How's the form? How are we all getting on? So Gaelic football looks set for more change, and that has been the topic of the conversation really across all GAA circles in the past couple of weeks or so. It obviously follows on from the news last week, following on from the news that a football review committee has very much been put in place following the appointment as Jarlath Burns as the new GAA president, obviously with Larry McCarthy, or Larry McConnell as maybe we should call him. That's a bit of a low joke, isn't it? But you get my point. He's obviously gone, and of course in comes Jarlath Burns. We'll get his name right. We won't do a Larry McCarthy on it. But look, it's interesting, isn't it? All the discussion right now around Gaelic football, people talking about the game obviously needing to change. We need to limit the amount of hand passes. We need to make the game sort of more entertaining and better to watch. And look, to a certain degree, I very much do agree, because of the fact that I think over the last sort of 10 years or so, Gaelic football has sort of moved away from being a very sort of kicking game, and almost every team have adopted some sort of a running game down the years, and obviously hand passing has been very, very active in Gaelic football at both club level and the county level over the last 10-15 years, and it's sort of evolved and kicked on. And of course defensive systems are very prevalent in Gaelic games right now, whether it be playing a sweeper, playing an extra sweeper, a double sweeper, getting every man inside your own half, getting every man inside your own 20-metre line. Like, it has been a very strong thing that we've saw in Gaelic football over, I would say, the last 20 years, but it's more and more so kicked on. And obviously Jim McGuinness coming in with Donegal. Look, I have no problems with defensive football. I've said it on multiple times. So this isn't a stab at Donegal, at Jim McGuinness, or anything like that. So don't take this out of context. But it does go to fair to say that obviously what he done with Donegal, winning the All-Ireland in the way that he did, getting over what was one of the greatest Dublin teams of all time in 2014, it very much sort of set the precedent for a lot of managers, a lot of coaches, a lot of county boards up and down the country to be like, okay, so if we go toe-to-toe with teams, we probably, toe-to-toe with the best teams, i.e. Dublin, Kerry and Mayo, like they were the three best sides throughout the 2010s. If we go toe-to-toe with them teams, more often than not, we're going to get beat. More often than not, we're going to get beat. So what can we do to try give ourselves the best possible chance at winning? And that's where over the top style defensive football has very much been a strong part of the game. Now, in my opinion, as I've said before, I have no real issue with teams setting up defensive, getting men behind the ball, trying to find the best way to win, because ultimately, look, different styles is what makes fights interesting. And if everyone played the exact same way, more often than not, you would have absolute hammerings week in, week out, in my opinion. I've seen this in Leinster football, because in the Leinster Championship down the years, so, a lot of the Meads, the Kildares, but even sort of further down the chain, the likes of Longford, Laois, Westmeath, Carlow, Carlow, to be fair, have had their own brand of defensive football when they were in the Carlow Rising days, and actually you saw where it took them. They got up to Division 3, Leinster semi-final, and even when they played Dublin many, many years ago, I think it was 2017, 2018, I think Dublin only beat them by like 8 or 9. But the point I'm making is, if you go toe-to-toe with teams like Dublin, you get absolutely hammered, and that was more than evident throughout a lot of Dublin's games in the Leinster Championship in the last 10-15 years, where Dublin would beat teams by 15, 20, 25 points. Now, obviously, there's bigger issues when it comes to that. Obviously, the size of Dublin, the size of the county, resources, everything else. It is a conversation for another day. But the point I'm more so getting at is that I do think when you go toe-to-toe with the big teams, more often than not, you're going to get absolutely hammered. So you can completely understand, Limerick playing a Kerry, or Clare playing a Kerry, or even Cork have done it, in the last couple of years, where they've come up against Kerry. They'll consolidate, they'll put men behind the ball, because ultimately, look, a 6, 7, 8 point defeat is a lot better than losing by 20 points. A 20-point defeat has the potential to absolutely derail your season. So I do think all this talk about changing Gaelic football, changing the way that the game is played, bringing in more new rules, to be honest with you, I think it's to detriment. It's to absolute detriment of the game, and I really don't think that. I'm all for trialing different things out. I'm all for maybe limiting the amount of hand passes certain teams can do in a specific attack. Maybe some sort of a stopwatch when a team has the ball, so they don't keep it for too long of a period. But I do think bringing in more new rules into the game and changing so many things It's going to make the game more confusing for players, for referees, for managers, for fans. And I just think it's going to ruin the game a little bit, in all honesty. And I think the fundamental, because obviously, let's get to this point. Let's discuss how we've ended up where we are at right now. In my opinion, as a fan, and obviously as someone who's running this channel, who's watched and covered GAA, quite religiously, really, for the last 4 or 5 years. In my opinion, how we've got to this point is the fact that you do have so many teams being overly defensive, which in many ways is limiting the fundamental skills of the game in terms of players. We're not seeing the best of certain players because of the way that some teams are setting up. And some teams have been very, very defensive in doing so, obviously, in keeping the ball and a lot of hand passes and blanket defense systems. That's very much how we've ended up here. But we need to also ask ourselves, why did teams start playing that way in the first place? And we'll go back to what I said earlier. Because the likes of Dublin, Kerry and Mayo were far too strong when it came to the rest, Tyrone obviously had that All-Ireland in 2021. Donegal had an All-Ireland in 2012. Those two were anomalies in more ways than one. Those two, other than that, it's been Dublin or Kerry in the last, 10 years. So I do think this whole, because those teams are so strong, that's why so many sides have felt like they've had to go defensive. Because ultimately, as a coach and as a manager, you don't walk into a dressing room, you don't walk into a team and be like, right, this is how we're going to play. We're going to play open, expansive, attacking football, but ultimately we're going to get beat by 15, 20 points because we don't have the quality of players that the opposition has. So let's give ourselves the best possible chance at winning. Let's get men behind the ball. Let's break on the counter-attack. And there's been so many examples of teams that have done this effectively. Fermanagh under Rory Gallagher were very good at this. They got to an Ulster final. Obviously, Derry under Rory Gallagher, and now obviously under Mickey Hart. Kieran Meena obviously in the final last year. They won Ulster titles. And don't get me wrong, Derry, I think, have proven that they have the players to actually go toe-to-toe with the best teams. But maybe a few years ago, they didn't, and they've obviously had to come up with a style to get the best out of what they have. I think the same is obviously applied to the likes of Donegal as well, winning the All-Ireland in 2012. You're looking at so many teams in the last couple of years that have pulled through and won big games and big championship games because of the fact that they've had a system in place that's given them the best possible chance of getting over the line. I think Cavan in 2020 is an example. Tipperary in 2020 is an example as well. And you go back and you look back at some big games over the last 10, 15 years, the amount of surprise one-off results that we've had, a lot of the time, in my opinion, have been down to the fact that teams have come up with a game plan to stifle the sort of bigger boys, shall we say. So, I think this whole thing, obviously Paul Flynn was chatting about it on the Sunday game. Eamon Fitzmaurice was chatting about it on the Sunday game as well. And obviously there was a proposal that was mentioned that I think Eamon Fitzmaurice said got rejected anyway, but it was obviously discussed. And you could tell actually watching the Sunday game that both Eamon Fitzmaurice and Paul Flynn, Paul Flynn obviously isn't, involved in that anymore, but Eamon Fitzmaurice is obviously part of this football review committee that has the likes of Jim Gavin in there as well. And Eamon Fitzmaurice not really giving anything away at all, do you know what I mean? Which, is understandable. He doesn't want to be the one to leak out the news, shall we say. But he was mentioning a sort of thing that could be done to limit defensive systems, and that would be that a defensive team would have to leave 3 men further up the field, in the opposition half, and leave 12 men inside their own half. Again, I think a rule like that would be catastrophic for Gaelic football, because then you have a situation where the opposition, are going to have 2 extra men, 2 extra outfield players in the opposition half, and the goalkeeper is going to be getting forward as well. The sweeper keeper role is going to play even more so of a role, and you're going to see defences get absolutely overloaded, and it's just going to be very hard to manage as well for referees and everything. So look, it's going to be interesting to see how they manage this. Ultimately, I've said on multiple occasions, I don't think changing the game, changing championship structures, doing this, doing that, is the way to fix the game. Don't get me wrong, I think some initiatives have been very good. I think the Tailteann Cup has been very, very good. I think last year's championship structure was actually very impressive as well, albeit we still came to very much a similar result in Dublin and Kerry playing each other in the All-Ireland final. But I think it's, the problem is much, much bigger, and obviously it can't be solved tomorrow or this year or next year, but I think resources have to be given to the smaller counties. Funds need to be given to the smaller counties. There needs to be campaigns in schools, promotional campaigns, all this sort of stuff to try and get younger people involved in Gaelic games in these counties. And then through time, you should hopefully see the sport grow. And there's multiple different ways I think you can go about it, multiple different models that you can follow. Look at Monaghan, for example, and what they've done in their county. And I do think there's ways that it can be done. Whether that's taken resources away from the bigger counties like Dublin and everything else, and given, allocating those resources elsewhere, I also think is a very smart thing to do potentially. But changing the rules and everything else, I don't really know if it works. Like the attacking mark came in, that for me has only made the game slower. You would worry, like, what is it? What rules can they actually bring in that will actually help Gaelic football overall? Because if you have every team playing the same style, more often than not, you're going to get the same results over and over again, and that's going to be Dublin, Kerry, maybe Mayo, Derry, whoever is, the top teams at the times is going to obviously kick on. And I just think if we start having more hammerings, like for example, Kerry playing Cork last year, I thought was a great example. Cork were very defensive. They got a lot of men behind the ball, and they nearly got something from that game. If Kerry and Cork go toe to toe, Kerry absolutely obliterate Cork. They absolutely obliterate them. And even look at Dublin and Kildare in the Leinster Championship last year. Kildare very, very defensive. Ironically, Kildare have been very poor this year, but they were actually very, very good that day in terms of how they were set up. They stifled Dublin, they slowed them down, they made life difficult, and they nearly beat Dublin in Croke Park, And if Kildare go toe-to-toe with Dublin, as they often have in previous years, Dublin have blown them away. So I just think the whole idea of changing the rules to try and make every team play attacking football, I think, in my opinion, won't work. And it's just going to leave us back to square one in terms of, the same teams being dominant every year. So look, I'd be curious to know what people think in the comments down below. I do think it's also worth mentioning as well, from watching Gaelic football a lot this year, inter-county football that is, I think defensive systems are slowly fading away. Like even watching Donegal at times, I don't think they play the same way under Jim McGuinness now than they have, sort of in the previous regime under Jim McGuinness. And from watching a lot of teams, I don't think defensive football is as prevalent anymore. I do think there is an overload on hand passes and everything else, but I don't think we're at sort of the 2020, 2019, 2018 when defensive football was very, very sort of evident in Gaelic football. But yeah, I'd be curious to know people's opinions. I just wanted to put this video out there. I didn't get a chance to sort of discuss this in any podcasts or anything like that, so just wanted to get people's opinions on it. Let me know what things you would change in Gaelic football in terms of how the sport is played. What rules would you maybe look to bring in? What rules would you get rid of? I think the attacker mark surely needs to go. Kick out mark maybe as well. But I'd be curious to know people's opinions. So yeah, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. There'll be more content coming out tomorrow, match reactions and everything else. So yeah, stay tuned for more videos, and we will speak to y'all soon.